paper reports that two of the male prostitutes were given a late-night tour of the White House last year.
You want answers. I want the truth. You can't handle the truth.
Hi, everybody. My name is Nick Bryant, and welcome to the Nick Bryant Podcast. Today, my guest is Peter Levenda. He is the author of more than 20 books, and he has tremendous expertise on the occult, the Nazis, and anything dark and sinister that you can think of. Peter is the man. Hey, how you doing, Peter?
After that introduction, not so sure. I'm doing great, Nick. How are you?
Good. So tell us a little bit about yourself, Peter.
Well, I'm from that backdrop area behind you there. I was born in the Bronx, but lived in New York, for a substantial period of time, got involved in the local scene, literary scene in a sense, the local literary arts scene back in the 60s. I graduated high school in the Bronx in 68. Gives you too much information. And so I hung out with a lot of people that were involved in what later became the kind of occult revival period of New York City, which was late 60s through the 70s until about 1980, until about the Reagan election, about that period of time. So that's why I came to know a lot of very strange people, just even as a teenager. My high school, Columbus High School, was where David Berkowitz went to school, where Christine Jorgensen went to school. So, already the influences were there. Talked to a lot of people in different areas of life, not only in the sort of religious, weird, mystical areas, but also politically, Weatherman, the Panthers and all of that, but also some of the international aspects as well. So the Northern Irish situation was very hot in those days, as was the Palestinian situation with the PLO and Yasser Arafat coming to the United Nations and all of this. So there was a lot of stuff going on, and I was the kind of person that would just sort of walk into these places and kind of sit there and ask questions and get the brochures and find out what was going on. So I got approached by the Moonies, by the Unification Church. I got approached by Scientologists. I got approached by everybody in those days. New York was the collection basket for all of this stuff. Everybody was there at some point, and we all knew each other at some point. We all forged these connections. Some were fleeting, some were more stable over decades. But for the most part, I found myself talking to a lot of people like that, a lot of very unique individuals, some of them very committed to what they were doing. Some were already forming political alliances. Others were sort of abandoning all of that in favor of a more, what we would probably call a more hippie kind of lifestyle, a more loose approach to religion and mysticism and politics. So we knew everybody. Everybody knew everybody in those days. And I think alliances were sort of subconsciously being formed even then.
I was in New York in 1979. It was the first time I came here. I was a kid from rural suburban Minnesota, and I found it mind-blowing. And I didn't stay that long the first time, but I ran in some pretty interesting circles myself. And I want to get into, we're going to look at the occult, various aspects of the occult, and we're going to have a discussion about it. And there's been a lot of accusations made about people in the occult practicing various negative things. And we're going to take a look at that too. And we're going to start with that occult group of all occult groups, the Knights Templar. And could you tell us a little bit about the Knights Templar, Peter?
Yeah, well, there's the historical Knights Templar that's been pretty well recorded historically. They started, I think, in the year 1118. It was a group of 9 French knights. They decided they were going to go to the Holy Land to protect Christian pilgrims. At that time, the Holy Land was under the rule of the of Islamic forces. It was back and forth between Christian and Muslim forces gaining control of certain parts of the Holy Land, Jerusalem being the primary target. And so these these 9 French knights got the blessing of Saint Bernard of Clairvaux, and they went out on this mission to protect pilgrims going to the Holy Land. Now we're talking 9 French guys, 9 knights taking vows
of Saint Bernard. We can't forget Saint Bernard.
Well, yeah. Well, Saint Bernard didn't go with them though. He stayed behind where it was safe. He blessed them. All of that, whatever value that was.
Blessing from Saint Bernard.
But Saint Bernard stayed home. But Saint Bernard was quite a mystic in his own right. I mean, he wasn't just a political engineer in this case. He wrote lengthy sermons on the Song of Solomon, which was one of the most mystical of the books of the Christian and the Jewish and Christian Bible. The Song of Solomon is really a love story. It's kind of erotic. And Bernard spent a lot of time writing about that, which will come into play later. But right now we have these 9 knights. They're going there, and they set up their bivouac at basically Solomon's temple in Jerusalem. And they were in the stables, I think, where the horses in the old days had been kept. And that's where they bivouac. That's where they set up their little base of operations. Well, something funny happens. We don't really quite understand it. But these 9 knights, they come back. They're called Knights of the Temple because they're based at Solomon's temple. So they are the Knights Templar. And they come back to France with a fortune. We don't know what this fortune consisted of. They came back with a lot of gold, a lot of money, a lot of perhaps intellectual fortune as well in terms of knowledge of things that they had learned while they were there. There were all sorts of stories. Did they find something at Solomon's temple? Did they find the Grail? Did they find the Ark of the Covenant? What did they find buried underneath Solomon's temple? So all these stories were spun about them. But one thing you can't avoid is that after they came back to France, how these 9 guys were protecting pilgrims is up to anybody's imagination, I guess. Even if they had assistance, it wasn't really a military base the way we would understand it today. So these 9 guys returned to France. In the space of 100 years, they built Gothic-style cathedrals all over France. I mean, the amount of monetary investment was enormous. And the amount of work to be accomplished in those days in that 100-year period was prodigious. They had to have a lot of workers. They had to have a lot of people who knew what they were doing, who understood geometry, who understood masonry, who understood how to build buildings this way. But these were not in the Romanesque style. These were real Gothic cathedrals, flying buttresses, and all of this weird stuff that they had learned somehow in the Middle East, they brought back with them, and they were going crazy building things. They became the people who originated the international banking system for the most part. These were people who were loaning money to kings and potentates all over Europe. So these guys, I don't know what they did, what happened to them, something happened to them. They came back and they were wealthy, they were smart, they were organized, and they were building a massive enterprise. So this was 1118 when it started. 200 years later, they were destroyed. They only lasted these 200 years. And they had loaned a lot of money to the King of France. They had loaned money here and there to various popes and various cardinals and archbishops and other noble people throughout Europe. And everybody finally decided, okay, enough is enough. We owe them too much money. The only way to get out of these debts is to get rid of them in particular. So they promoted a story that the Knights Templar were worshiping the devil. And the name of the devil was Baphomet. That's the name that they came up with somehow. And they were worshiping a head in a chapel somewhere, and the head was talking to them, or all kinds of stuff. They spit on the cross. They trampled the cross.
Sexuality, then.
Homosexuality was part of it, sure. But it was the Satan worshiping that got everybody hot and bothered, right? So on October 13th, Friday the 13th, they arrested the Templars throughout their area of control, throughout France, parts of other countries in Europe. They were all under arrest. The Templars were fleeing for their lives. Their Grand Master, Jacques de Molay, was arrested and thrown into prison and eventually executed, burned at the stake, for being a Satanist and for whatever trumped up charges they had. This is where the story then shifts into a different gear completely. Okay, the Templars are destroyed. Not exactly. The Templars were a multinational operation. So they had forces in Spain and Portugal. They had forces and connections all the way up into England, the British Isles, all the way up into Scotland. They were stretched all over the place, and not everybody was anti-Templar. So some of the countries gave permission for the Templars to move there, to relocate, to set up shop, sometimes under different names. In Portugal, it was a different name. I think it was the Order of St. John. And I visited some of those castles in Portugal. These were Templar castles. There's no question about it. These guys were Templars. And there's even the rumor that Columbus's 3 ships sailed, the Nina, Pinta, and Santa Maria were Templar ships because of the red Templar crosses on their sails. So there was a lot of discussion that the Templars simply went underground, took a lot of their finances with them, and continued their operations where they could under different names, different assumed names. So we kind of have the prototype here of, an organized crime operation from one perspective, or a kind of Fourth Reich, Odessa-file kind of operation from another point of view. Depending on how you want to look at it, it was the same group, but different names, funneling money, moving assets across international boundaries, and setting up shop in different places.
And ultimately, a number of them migrated to Scotland. And
yeah.
They transformed themselves into the Masons. I think that's fairly well accepted today. I don't think that there's a lot of debate about it.
Well, this is what happened. You see, they were destroyed, quote unquote, in the early 1300s, like 1322, I think, or a little earlier than that, 1312, where they were destroyed. About 150 years later, from Scotland, we find the earliest Masonic documents. And these are documents that talk about having learned geometry, having learned the arts of Masonry from the Middle East, which is where the Templars had been located. This information was brought back, and it was secret, and there are certain rules that people must follow in order to gain this sacred information, to learn how to do all these things. And there was a mystical religious component to what should have been just simply putting one brick on top of another, right? So the idea that there was a mystical component, a sacred geometry, became something that was at the heart of Freemasonry since its earliest documents. Most historians talking about the Freemasons say, well, the first Grand Lodge was 1717 in London. That's true for the first Grand Lodge, but there were Masonic lodges going back at least 150 years earlier than that. So you can suddenly see the timeline is getting telescoped. It's getting closer and closer to when the Templars left Europe and went to Scotland in the 1300s. And 100 years later, suddenly there are these documents that exist talking about the rituals of initiation of Masons and the rules they must follow, and linking it to ancient Egypt, linking it to sacred geometry and all of that. It was already happening. So it's a pretty good chance that there was a Templar Masonic connection. And I think a lot of people tend to admit that that is so. They may not be able to prove it completely with a unbroken line of succession, but it's certainly suggestive. You can make a very good circumstantial case for it.
Well, then there's the Roslyn Chapel, which is about 10 miles from Edinburgh, that has a number of Templar symbols and ultimately Masonic symbols.
Sure.
And there's a lot of people that think that the Masons are up to something sinister. A lot of people think that anything that takes place in a secret society is sinister. And people tend to generalize, like Masons are into occult practices and doing very bad things, but there's thousands of Masons, thousands. Right. And some are very well practicing highly negative behavior, but I don't think that the majority are.
No, I mean, the Masons refer to themselves not as a secret society, but as a society with secrets, which is, I guess, one way of getting around it. But the rituals are published. They're there for anybody to see. I mean, you can pick up a copy, you can download from the internet the initiation rituals, especially the first three, the Blue Lodge degrees, the degree 1, 2, and 3, which are the core degrees of Freemasonry, and which involve a death and a resurrection, right? So the idea of building the temple and dying to your old life and being reborn into a new one, and having a group of people that are like-minded, have gone through the same things as you have, that's about the extent of it in the Blue Lodge, degrees, those first three degrees. The whole thing of the Scottish Rite and all these extra degrees, the Templar degree, the Rosicrucian degree, all of this came much later. And part of it was due to a guy called Albert Pike, who had been a Confederate officer during the Civil War in the United States. And he was very pro-Confederacy, but he was also a Freemason, and started to write these long treatises on Freemasonry, on the mystical principles, and on additional degrees. And then, there were degrees, the Scottish Rite degrees, coming from Scotland themselves, having to do with King James and Charles and the whole Stuart thing that was going on, and all this political stuff that was going on in the 18th century between the rulership of England and Scotland, and who was in charge. So James VI of Scotland became James I of England as king, and there was the rumors that he was involved with the Templars, and he was involved with the Freemasons and all of that. So there were certain rites that were developed during that time purporting to be additional rites with political and mystical overtones as well. So you have all this additional stuff, but still those things are published. You can read them. And that brings us to another interesting story, because the guy who first published these things was a guy called Morgan in upstate New York. And he published the rituals, the first three degrees of rituals. And, Freemasons take an oath that they will not reveal the secrets under pain of death. I mean, horrible, hideous death. They take this oath. And this guy disappeared. This was in the early 19th century, 18 something, very early years of that time.
Wasn't his body found in a pond, or the remnants of his body?
The remnants, yes, what they believe was his body.
Yeah.
And then his widow survived him. And therein lies a tale, because then she winds up marrying Joseph Smith, the man who founds the Church of Latter-day Saints, who then also became a Freemason. The whole thing is very messy.
With the Freemasons, there is a division within the Freemasons called the Jesters. And they've been associated with some pretty big time debauchery. And I'll provide links for everything that I'm saying. The Jesters, the Buffalo, a daily out of Buffalo talked about the Jesters being busted for prostitution, but actually are using prostitutes and having wild bashes. But actually, ABC News had a segment where a number of jesters had rented like very large boats and toured the Amazon. And every place that they stopped at the Amazon, there was young girls provided for them, minors. And I was, before this podcast, I was looking for that ABC clip because it was pretty thorough, but I could not find it. But I did find another article about the same thing. So although the Masons as a whole may not practice licentious activities towards children or other people, the jesters certainly seem to have been, that seems to be part of their go. And also what's interesting about the jesters is a number of them are very, very major players in politics, and they're considered almost like the elite of Freemason or the Shriners.
Well, there's issues with this, I think. There's Propaganda Due as well. There's P2 in Italy, and that was a Masonic lodge, but it was considered a sort of not a legitimate Masonic lodge, right? Because there's a lot of those around. They proliferate. A lot of people call themselves Masons, and they're not. But in the case of P2, it was very questionable. They were not really a legitimate Masonic lodge, but they were involved in political assassinations and political uprisings, all sorts of corruption activities in Italy and the rest of Europe, but also with connections to South America and some of the anti-communist pogroms, you might call them, the anti-communist activities down in the Southern Cone, in particular in the Mercosur region, so Argentina, Chile, Brazil, that part of the world, where you have very strong Nazi and Masonic connections working hand in glove together. Their goals were political. P2 was primarily political, very anti-communist, involved in, like I say, assassinations. They say Michele Sindona was killed by P2, and on and on. So all of this, the Vatican banking scandals, and all of us are connected with a Masonic lodge. And so there's that.
Masonic lodge.
Excuse me?
It was a very right-wing Masonic.
Absolutely, yeah. 100% right-wing. And involved with to an extent with the Nazi operations, underground operations in South America. So you had a lot of the same fellow travelers. They would put out hits on anti-Nazis in Europe and in North America as well. So you have these kind of side operations where Masonic groups get together for specific purposes, like-minded people. But if you're a member of P2, as an example, you're a member of P2 because you've been invited specifically to join that group, because it's been recognized that you're one of them anyway. So there's no it's not an eyes wide shut situation, right? This you really know what you're getting into right up front. You know, this is the group that you want to join if you want to have political connections and you want to get things done. If it would come to a situation of that you mentioned, for instance, the gestures, is that, organized pedophilia to me is the one thing that I'm having the hardest trouble with, because they would have to be real pedophiles to begin with. Would they need a Masonic structure for any reason? Would that protect them? What would that do for them? Why would you even have, a group of do pedophiles really want to sit in the same room with each other? I mean, I don't know. I know that there's been international organizations of pedophiles, obviously through the internet, but they never actually meet, right? So they're exchanging film, they're exchanging photographs, contact information, that kind of thing. They're supporting each other this way without the benefit of occult rituals. So this is the part that I find the hardest to understand conceptually or even structurally, organizationally, I guess is what I'm trying to say.
How I think it comes about is the gestures were obviously molesting minors on the Amazon. Okay. ABC really nailed them. I can't find those clips. But I think wherever you've got a large constituency of people, like if you have a large constituency of people and a number of them are drug addicts, they will find each other. I mean, that's just tautological. And I think that the same thing may have happened with the gestures, or maybe it's some kind of subgroup within the gestures, but it is definitely the gestures.
But that still doesn't answer my question. So when you have a bunch of drug dealers, they will find each other for sure, but they'll also slit each other's throats for the drugs, right? There's no loyalty there among the drug dealers. They will always be, or the drug users, they'll always be looking for some angle to get over on the other guy, because there's a limited supply and they want to dominate it. I don't see them all getting together like in a room and taking oaths of, loyalty to Satan or something and doing drugs. I mean, it doesn't go together with the drug mentality. The druggie mentality is not patient that way,
But if you're in a large organization, you're going to find people that are like you.
Exactly. Yeah. That's different. Yeah.
And obviously the gestures found each other because of their trips down the Amazon, which were described as pretty horrific by ABC News. And these were gestures. I mean, so I don't know how they found each other. One of them was a former governor of, I believe, Arizona, but I could be wrong on that. So it's, and I'm not indicting all Masons, for sure. I'm just saying that there is this subsect in Masonry that has been busted, having wild parties with prostitutes and also with molesting minors. So let's move on to John Dee and Enochian magic and his speaking with the dead. He was a magician in the 1500s.
Yeah, Queen Elizabeth I, during her reign, John Dee was a mathematician. He was an intellectual of the time. He published the first ever English translation of Euclid, for instance. So the guy was not the way we today think of occultists as kind of hippie types in basements lighting candles. In those days, this was an expensive hobby. John Dee had all kinds of equipment and books, and he spent a fortune on getting all of this material together and then getting involved in trying to contact the angels, trying to contact angelic forces. And he became successful at this when he was working with a friend of his, somebody he came across called Edward Kelly. Kelly had a gift for scrying, as they call it. He had a gift for looking into a crystal ball, basically, and seeing images and then reporting what he was seeing. Dee could not do that to save his life. Dee was a pure intellectual. He had no psychic ability, at least that's what Dee would claim. There were moments when Dee would have visions or hear things or see things like that. But for the most part, he needed Kelly's help. And between the two of them, they started this operation, which then became very famous, infamous, really, where they made contact with angelic forces, or let's say non-worldly forces, whether you consider them angelic, demonic, ultra-terrestrial, extraterrestrial, or anything else. So they made contact with these forces. But the method of contact was extremely complicated. The point being that there was a special language involved. The language itself was powerful. Actually pronouncing the words was powerful. Just even seeing the words is supposedly powerful. So the angels would create these, they would have these grids, these empty grids like chessboard grids, but much more complicated, many more squares. And the angels would go and start pointing to letters in these squares and forming words, but doing it backwards, by the way, just to make it even more ridiculous. So they would communicate entire prayers, incantations, and everything else using this very tedious process. And there was some kind of hidden mathematics involved as well, according to Dee's notebooks and some of the other people who have studied them. So you have a mathematical system, you have a completely new language called angelic or Enochian, because it was believed to be the language spoken by Enoch in the Bible to the angels and the angels to Enoch. So this was their language, an angelic language or an Enochian language. And these texts have been published, not all of them. There's still some, I think, at the British Museum and the British Library that have not yet made it into print, but a lot of it already has. You can find them in a lot of places, and they're incomprehensible at first. You have to really get into the mindset of these Elizabethan magicians to figure out what they're up to. But the idea is that these incantations are so powerful and at the same time so dangerous that they actually get results for people who bother to go through the steps necessary, creating the equipment, following all the instructions the right way, as Dee and Kelly laid it down. So that was, during the Elizabethan period. So they did some of this in Prague, in what's now the Czech Republic. They traveled all over the place. They were the guests of kings and queens all over Europe. They were very celebrated. They were involved in alchemy as well. Kelly was involved in alchemy and trying to change lead into gold. So they were really deeply involved in all the occultism of that time, all the European style occultism of that time. And this magical system is what they came up with, and it's supposed to be extremely potent. And I've looked at it for years. I've studied it. I've taken it apart. I've looked at the moving pieces of it, trying to figure out what is it as a system. And I think that the people who started the Golden Dawn, which was another occult society in England in the 19th century, had a pretty good handle on it. They didn't have a really perfect grasp of it. I think no one does yet, but they had a pretty good understanding of it, and they were able to create a completely heavily articulated magical occult system based on the Dee and Kelly system, based on the Enochian system. And they really made it blossom into all different kinds of other areas. And even that was considered flawed. So you can imagine how, potentially powerful the system is.
Dee and his buddy went to Prague, and they almost, that was almost the end of their life.
Yeah.
They were threatened. And actually, what's interesting about Dee is that he was an intelligence agent. And this is a theme that will play out as we talk about additional quote unquote magicians or occultists, that they are members of intelligence agencies. So,
well, Dee was not a member of an agency. He was on his own, pretty much. He reported directly to Queen Elizabeth.
yes.
And he was asked to find out information, asked to carry messages back and forth, doing all the things an intelligence agent would do, plus his command of various languages also. He was sort of ideally placed. But the Knights Templar had also come across an ideal intelligence agency in the assassins and the Hashishin of the Middle East, who were basically created the modern intelligence agency, using different costumes, disguises, different languages, different martial arts, different arts of poison, carrying messages, coded messages, that sort of thing. So it's already there with the Templars. You already see the beginnings of it there. And of course, they were a multinational operation. So secrecy was important for their operation as well. And then Dee just put the icing on the cake. Here was a guy working straight for the Queen.
The latter group gets their name because they were quite fond of hash and smoked a lot of hash. And I can't think of like assassins smoking a lot of hash. I'm sure that they managed, but I'm thinking about some guys smoking hash, maybe with wearing Birkenstocks and a tie-dye T-shirt. And
No, the hash there was used as an initiation tool, basically. Yes. You would give you a little hash, you would drink this, you would smoke this stuff, and then you would see visions. And Hassani Sabah would say, okay, that's what you're going to see when you're dead. So fear not death, right? You're going to go into the enemy camp, you're going to kill the king, and maybe they'll catch you, maybe they don't. If they catch you and they kill you, no big deal. You've already seen what paradise looks like. That was the idea anyway.
Smoking hash and seeing paradise. Maybe that happens to this day.
By the dashboard light. Yeah.
Now, an interesting practitioner of Enochian magic was Joseph Smith.
Mm-hmm.
Give us a background about Joseph Smith, the founder of the Mormons.
Yeah. Joseph Smith came from a family of people who made money in upstate New York in the early 1800s by treasure hunting. And it was using a dowsing stick, like the kind that people use to try to find water under the surface of the earth. They would try to find gold or hidden treasure, hidden money, buried money this way. And Joseph Smith started that way. But he came across a book that was published at that time, was very popular in England, and could be found in bookstores all over the area where he lived in upstate New York. It was called The Magus, and it was by Francis Barrett. You can still get that book today. And what Francis Barrett did is he took a lot of stuff from various other books of magic, including most especially Agrippa, Cornelius Agrippa's 3 books of magic, and the sort of pseudo Agrippa 4th book of magic, and put all this together with a bunch of other stuff in this book that was called The Magus. And so it's filled with rituals, and it's filled with symbols. It's filled with diagrams of the talismans you're supposed to make, and symbols of the spirits, and sacred numbers connected with the spirits and the planets and all of this. I mean, it's a treasure trove of stuff. And Smith got a hold of this and other books as well that they were selling at that time, and began using the material in those books to conduct occult operations, ceremonial magic in upstate New York. There is really no question about this. I mean, the LDS Church has for a while, tried to block this type of thing coming out, or they tried to poo-poo it or say that it was not that important. But the more we know about it today, the more we know about Joseph Smith and what he was doing and how he was doing it, the more we realize this was true. He was really working with the system of ceremonial magic. And ceremonial magic is a kind of Western version of shamanism, let's say. And what it involves is drawing circles on the ground using the appropriate incenses, the appropriate colors, the appropriate incantations to summon a spirit to appear, and then to command that spirit to do something for you, whether it's to find money or love or a positive outcome in a court case or any of these kinds of things. All of these sort of mundane things. You find the spirit, you command them to tell you this. Well, Joseph Smith did that. I mean, he literally did that. And he would go, on a specific day during the year, and he would conduct these ceremonies at this hill near where he lived in Palmyra, New York. And he would conduct these things. And a spirit would come and tell him, not now, come back next year, right? And then he would do the same thing and come back next year. I think it was 3 years in a row. And finally, at the time of the third year, there was this explosion. Something happened. There was an angel. There was a hole in the ground. And Joseph Smith dug up golden plates. And on these golden plates was written what we know today as the Book of Mormon. So they were not in English, evidently. They had been buried there centuries, 1,000 years, 2,000 years before. They were in Egyptian hieroglyphics. Now, in 1822, 23, 24, when all this was going on, no one had yet deciphered the hieroglyphics, right? So the hieroglyphics were considered to be a priestly language, something very occult, like the Enochian language, something that the very symbols had power. So Smith had these golden plates, but now he's supposed to translate them into English. And he does that with the same thing that Dr. John Dee used to use, a show stone, which means a kind of crystal ball. It's a flat piece of glass, maybe. It could be any kind of very shiny rock or substance. He would put in the bottom of a hat, like a stovepipe hat, and look into the hat in the darkness, and he would see the translations of the Egyptian hieroglyphics come out, and he would dictate them to someone else, and that person would write down. The entire Book of Mormon was translated this way.
You wrote a book about Joseph Smith and the Mormon Church, and you pretty much deconstructed his veracity. I mean, even as far as the gold plates, what are your thoughts about the gold plates?
Well, we know he had pieces of parchment on which there was Egyptian hieroglyphics written, and he, quote unquote, translated them. Of course, they're totally erroneous, right? We know what the hieroglyphics say today, but in those days, he could say anything and you'd have to believe him. So he got away with a lot of that. The whole thing of the golden plates and all of this is it was kind of debunked almost at the time, because one of the people involved in that, in taking that dictation, later came out and kind of pushed back on all of that, saying that's not exactly what happened. You basically had Smith creating the Book of Mormon out of whole cloth. The fascinating thing, though, is that the Book of Mormon is pretty consistent. It's pretty consistent in its language. It's a very complicated plot that goes on forever, with all different kinds of tribes and names and places and all of this that are all supposed to have to be located in North America. So it's kind of a work of art, right? I mean, as a science fiction, as perhaps the first science fiction tale ever written, I mean, it's kind of a work of art. And people read this thing and they kind of had to believe it. It's like, who would make this up, right? I think that Smith was basically a genius for this kind of thing. I mean, he was a very creative individual. And I think he was a con man the way many artists are, in a sense, right? You're manipulating reality. He grew up as a con man. He grew up, looking for gold and buried in people's houses and stuff. I mean, weird stuff like this. But there's that one incident in Salem, Massachusetts, that sort of hangs out there. Like maybe he did believe that he was able to do this, because he went to Salem. This is obviously more than 100 years after the Salem witch trials, but he was related by blood, I think, to one of the witch finders at Salem. Not one of the witches, one of the other guys. And in that particular house where they lived, the spirits had told him there was gold buried in that house. And so they went and so they took over the house. It was empty. And he brought a bunch of his friends in there, and they were conducting occult ceremonies in that house in an effort to find gold. We don't know what they ever did find. We think they didn't find anything. But he did have this strong connection back to Salem, to the witch trials and all the rest of it. And then later, of course, there was the scandal about the salamander letter that Joseph Smith must have been contacting the devil, because the salamander is a symbol of the devil, and it's the element of fire, et cetera, et cetera. So there was a long, in the 20th century, there was a murder case surrounding a fictionalized version of this letter. So the LDS Church has always been aware of the occult background of Joseph Smith. They played it down, just the way Scientologists today play down the occult background of L. Ron Hubbard. And they both created American religions, and they both created American religions that were based upon going to the stars later and having your own planet and all the rest of it. There's a lot of similarities between Hubbard and Joseph Smith, and in the magic that they both practiced, because both of their systems come from the same source, ultimately from Agrippa, and through Agrippa, Francis Barrett's book, The Magus.
And Joseph Smith was also a Freemason, too.
Yes, he joined the Freemasons very enthusiastically, and later became involved with having created the largest Masonic lodge in the country, in the United States, in Indiana. He had created this elaborate operation, and he was initiating people left and right, and he made Freemasonry an integral part of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. So that became like an essential aspect of it. The whole temple ceremony stuff that the Mormons have, it's based on Masonic ideas, based on Masonic dress, based on Masonic symbols. Joseph Smith was an enthusiastic Freemason.
And Joseph Smith ultimately is murdered, and Brigham Young leads the Mormons to the Promised Land in Utah.
Yeah. That's right.
About 3 or 4 podcasts ago, I interviewed someone who's written a series of articles about ritual abuse and the Mormon Church. And I'd heard about that earlier. And actually, there was a commission set up in Utah in 1992, I believe it was, to look at ritual abuse in Utah. And they came to the conclusion that there was actually ritual abuse in Utah.
Well, none of it surprises me. When you have, why wouldn't they? I mean, from my perspective is, why wouldn't they? We know right now, it's almost a cliche that the Catholic Church was involved in pedophilia, right? And protecting pedophile priests. So we know this happened. We know that there was abuse of children under the care of Catholic priests and nuns. There was a famous case of the Grey Nuns of Montreal in Canada. There was the case now we have where the Pope, the present day Pope, Pope Francis, has come back to Canada and apologized to the Indigenous people of Canada for the abuses that their children suffered at the hands of Catholic priests and nuns, right? At Catholic schools, at Catholic foster homes and things of that nature. So we know this went on in virtually every religion. During the time of the Islamic State in the Middle East, they would capture Yazidi women and children for the same purposes. They would sexually abuse them. They would marry them according to their understanding, or their twisted understanding of Islamic law. They would marry 14-year-old, 12-year-old, 13-year-old girls for a short period of time, and then divorce them and sell them to someone else. And that was happening. That's happening, still happening to an extent today. There's still Yazidi women and children who are missing in that part of the world because of the Islamic State. So we know this goes on. The extent to which it goes on within a ritual context is what interests me, and I'm still trying to find out a case where the ritual and the abuse goes together, and one is not the excuse for the other, just sort of a window dressing for just genuine pedophiles, as in the case of the Islamic State and what they were doing to Yazidis, because they felt the Yazidis were not, they were neither Christian nor Muslim. They were not people of the book. They were devil worshippers, according to Muslim lore. The Yazidis worship the devil. This is not true, but anyway, this is the way they're portrayed. Therefore, it's okay. It's open season. But then the pedophilia and the child trafficking and the human trafficking took place within their already established context. They didn't create a special, sort of satanic cult to do this. That was just part of it. as it was in the Catholic Church. It's just part of what was going on. It was not a separate group within the church. It was just, pedophiles operating within the church. So is that what was happening with the Mormons in Utah is my question. Or is there an establishment of child abuse and human trafficking within any organized religion of any kind, right? So this is what I focus on because I hear a lot about it. And then it's like grasping smoke, right? You get close to it and then suddenly it all dissipates, like the satanic abuse survivor stuff that we went through in the 80s, where they claim millions of kids had been sacrificed in satanic rituals, and then they couldn't find any. They couldn't find corpses. They couldn't find records. They couldn't find anything. So they kind of gave up and said it must be speculation, right? It's just people getting hysterical, as they did with Salem.
But a lot of those numbers were pumped up by the False Memory Syndrome Foundation, who made these allegations look
Right.
Absolutely ridiculous. And we both know that there were at least 2 people in the False Memory Syndrome Foundation on their membership board that had perpetrated CIA mind control programs. And so somehow there's a nexus with intelligence. And why would the CIA want to help an organization form that said that the false memory syndrome is millions of people have it? And why would they? And one of the people who formed it was a child molester. So why would the CIA get involved in that? I don't have any idea, except to maybe cover their tracks.
Well, I don't know. When we say, did the CIA do it, or did individuals within the CIA or part of CIA contract organizations do it? That's the other problem, because to me, there's a major contradiction here. The CIA insists, we take it with a grain of salt, but they insisted, especially Dick Helms and during the time of Richard Helms, insisted that MK Ultra and all of those programs didn't work. In the end, you can't do that. You can't replace memories. There's no such thing as implanted memories. We tried to do it. We couldn't do it. We failed. And then you have the false memory group, which is saying, oh, there's people implanting false memories. And there's another group saying, no, they're not false memories. They're real memories. So it's like, make up your minds, guys. Are we implanting false memories in people, or are these real memories that we've uncovered? You can't really have it both ways, ideologically speaking. Maybe if you're a psychiatrist, you're going to say, well, this patient had a memory implanted, but this patient has a memory that was not implanted. It's a real memory. How do you tell the difference between them then? How do we know what's real and what's false? We know we have false memories. That's why we don't trust eyewitness testimony, in courts of law. That's the shakiest part of testimony, is eyewitness. You need the DNA evidence, you need surveillance cameras and all the rest of it, because 5 eyewitnesses to a single crime will give you 5 different descriptions of the perpetrator. My response to that has always been, yes, but all 5 will admit something happened. So you start from there. Maybe the guy was short, maybe he was tall, maybe it was a man or a woman, but was a murder committed? Well, yeah, there's a body, right? So work backwards from there. The same thing with the memories. If people are coming up with memories of satanic abuse, for instance, start from there then. Go and find out, where's the body? Where did they conduct the ritual? What kind of ritual was conducted? What language was it in? Was it satanic the way we think of it? Was it something else? Was it Santeria? Was it, Palo Mayombe? What was it, right? Try to get a fix on it using the available data that we have, and assume that the memory is not complete. If there is a memory, it's contaminated with our own ideas of what we think should have been there, or what was there, or we're connecting it to something we saw in a movie or read in a book, and we're conflating issues, right? But something still happened. For instance, John Mack, for instance, realized that a lot of the UFO abductees that he talked to were all suffering from PTSD. He didn't believe their stories were literally true, but he believed something happened. They're all reporting a similar situation in similar tones, and they're all suffering from genuine PTSD. So you start from there and kind of work your way back, instead of saying whatever they told me must be exactly true the way they said it.
Let's move on to Aleister Crowley, the Beast, and Ordo Templi Orientis. Could you fill us in a little bit about the OTO?